we're jumping right into a seriously fascinating clash of ideas from the 19th century. We've got an intellectual duel between the legendary political economist John Stuart Mill and an anonymous laborer, known to history simply as a working man. You know, it's incredibly rare to find historical documents where a boots-on-the-ground factory worker actually goes toe-to-toe with the academic theories of a giant like Mill. But that's exactly what we have today. We're going to break down how these two viewed the very foundations of wealth, labor, and society. And trust me, you'll quickly see why these 1866 arguments are still ridiculously relevant today.
To kick things off, our anonymous author launches a pretty massive critique right at the ivory tower economists of his era. He essentially argues that thinkers like Mill don't study the origins of capital the way a scientist studies nature. Instead, they just take the status quo for granted and write apologetic eulogies for it. It's a huge accusation, really. He's saying political economy had basically become a handmaid to the ruling classes, rather than an objective science.
So let's get into round one, the true origin of capital.
This is the foundational disagreement that literally ripples through everything else they argue about. I mean, where does wealth actually come from? John Stuart Mill, following in the footsteps of Adam Smith, argues that capital comes from saving and abstinence. The idea is that the wealthy get wealthy by being super frugal. The working man, he absolutely rejects this. He argues that capital is actually built by appropriating the past labor of others, with the capitalist just stepping in as a middleman between the people making the goods and the people buying them.
And to back this up, he points to a pretty staggering number, 1,030. He uses this exact multiplier to completely roast Mill's abstinence theory. See, at the time, an aristocrat might pull in an income of £50,000, while your average adult laborer was making just over £58 a year. So the working man asks a very practical, almost sarcastic question. How could one guy possibly abstain or work 1,030 times harder than a highly skilled laborer?
He even brings in Professor Leon Levy's own economic data from the time to prove his point. Let's break down the math. Out of the 69 pounds of value that an average worker produced every year, they only took home 38. That remaining 31 pounds, that was appropriated by the capitalist class. So, to the working man, capital isn't magically generated because some rich guy skipped his morning coffee. It is mathematically extracted from the laborers doing the actual work.
Which brings us to round two, the overproduction debate.
Mill argued, from a purely academic standpoint, that a general oversupply of goods is impossible. His logic was that supply creates its own purchasing power. Basically, if you double the supply of stuff, you theoretically double the purchasing power of the community to buy that stuff. In Mill's theoretical vacuum, the market just flawlessly balances itself out. But does that actually hold up in the real world? The working man didn't think so. He completely dismantled that abstract theory using gritty, real-time trade reports of factory closures all over England. He asked, hey, if oversupply is impossible, why are the warehouses in Bradford currently overflowing? Why are mills in Leeds and Manchester cutting workers back to 4 days a week? He argued that a deadlock happens for a very simple reason. Workers just aren't paid enough to buy back the very things they're overproducing.
All right, round three, the impact of machinery.
This hits on a massive existential question of the era. Do improvements in production permanently injure the laboring class? Mill answered this with a very firm no, believing that technological improvements rarely hurt labor in the grand scheme of things. But our anonymous author attacked that idea with cold, hard historical data.
Look at what happened when power looms were introduced. The wages of hand-loom weavers didn't just dip, they crashed. Over an 18-year period, the pay for weaving the exact same 24 yards of cloth plummeted by 50%, dropping from 2 shillings down to just 1. Production exploded, sure, but the individual worker's livelihood was literally sliced in half.
He didn't stop there. He documented specific staffing changes in Manchester machine shops to show that mechanization was actively kicking humans out of jobs, not absorbing them into new ones. In one single shop, 20 self-acting lathes were doing the work of 100 men. For the working man, the relentless drive to lower production costs meant erasing the worker from the equation entirely. Honestly, it's wild how closely that mirrors our conversations today about automation and AI, isn't it?
He summed up this grim reality with a pretty hardcore analogy. He called capital a roaring lion seeking whom it can devour. He didn't see it as a benevolent force at all. To him, the capitalist mode of production was a permanent social war. A war where the machine owners won all the battles and the displaced laborers suffered all the casualties.
Moving on to round 4, the peasant farming illusion. Now, Mill's proposed solution to rural poverty was to break up common lands and create a class of small, independent peasant farmers. He had this highly romanticized vision of a happy, self-sufficient guy who eats his own grain, drinks his own wine, and just totally ignores market prices. The working man basically called this a fantasy. He pointed to the actual reality in places like France and Switzerland, where small farmers were drowning in mortgages, paying crazy interest rates, and literally subsisting on buttermilk and brown bread just to keep their tiny plots of land. To really drive home the sheer brutality of land economics back then, he highlights this jaw-dropping number: 300,000. That's the number of Irish laborers that landlords simply decided were surplus to requirements. They actively wanted them deported or pushed to emigrate. The author argued that under the strict, unfeeling rules of supply and demand, human lives were being treated with the exact same disposability as old, redundant steam engines. And that leads us to our final showdown. Round 5, property and the future.
This is where their philosophical differences absolutely peak. Mill defended movable property as a sacred absolute right, even if he was willing to admit that land was a common inheritance. The working man completely disagreed. He argued that movable goods are just as much a joint social product as land is. Think about a suit of clothes. It requires silk from China, wool from Australia, and the combined labor of countless spinners and weavers. The aristocrat wearing that suit did absolutely nothing to actually create it, yet claims total ownership over it.
Because of this mindset, he completely redefined the concept of profit. To the working man, profit was not some natural reward for a capitalist being frugal, not at all. It was just a byproduct of an economic setup where producers and consumers are artificially kept apart by middlemen. He argued that if a community produced goods solely for its own consumption, you'd have immense wealth, sure, but absolutely zero profit in the capitalist sense of the word.
So we're going to wrap up this explainer with a final, highly provocative question pulled straight from the working man's logic. It goes like this. If we all agree that the landlord did not create the earth, we have to look at the factories, the machines, and the capital and ask, who actually built them? It's a question from the 1860s, but it still echoes through every single modern debate we have about wealth, labor, and the economic structures that govern our lives today. Something to think about.